Riverside, California, 1967. A 12-year-old boy named Michael Anthony Sobolewski pressed his ear against a transistor radio in a small bedroom that smelled of motor oil and old carpet. The sound coming through that tiny speaker, the low, heavy throb of a bass guitar, stopped him cold. He had never heard anything like it. It felt like something moving through the floor, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. His father, Gerald, was a jazz musician, a trumpet player who believed in discipline and structure. Music in that house was not a dream. It was work. Every note had a rule. Every scale had a consequence. Michael grew up understanding that music demanded something from you. It took before it gave. By the time he was 15, he had saved enough money from odd jobs to buy his first bass, a cheap instrument, secondhand. The neck was slightly warped, but he played it every single day. He was not the flashiest kid in school. He was not loud. He did not seek attention. What he had was something quieter, and in many ways more powerful. He had endurance. He had the ability to lock into a rhythm and hold it like a stone wall while everything else moved around him. In 1974, playing in a local band called Snake, Michael walked into a rehearsal space in Pasadena and heard two brothers arguing in Dutch. One of them was behind a drum kit. The other was holding a guitar like it was part of his body. Their name was Van Halen. That rehearsal lasted 4 hours. No one wanted to stop. Michael Anthony did not know it yet, but he had just walked into the most important room of his life. What happened inside that room, and what it would eventually cost him, is where this story truly begins. Pasadena in the mid-1970s was loud, restless, and hungry. The Sunset Strip was only 30 miles away, but it felt like another universe. Local bands played backyard parties, church halls, and parking lots. Most of them disappeared before they ever found a stage worth standing on. Van Halen was different. Everyone who heard them knew it immediately. There was something in the room when they played. A pressure, a heat, like standing too close to fire. Michael Anthony fit in from the first note. He and Eddie developed a musical connection that went beyond technique. Eddie played guitar the way lightning moves, unpredictable, violent, and gone before you could process it. Michael's job was to be the ground beneath that lightning, and he was perfect at it. His bass lines were not complicated. They were not meant to be. They were the foundation that made Eddie's chaos feel like architecture. David Lee Roth joined shortly after. Charismatic, theatrical, impossible to ignore. Together, the four of them, Eddie, Alex, David, and Michael, began playing every venue that would have them. High schools, clubs, a famous residency at the Starwood in Hollywood, where they packed the room every single week through 1977. Gene Simmons of Kiss saw them at the Starwood. He was stunned enough to personally fund a demo tape. That tape did not lead to an immediate deal, but it proved something. It proved they were real. When Warner Brothers signed Van Halen in 1977, Michael Anthony stood in that room and signed his name. He was 23 years old. His hands were steady. His eyes were clear. What no one told him, what no piece of paper made obvious, was that his signature that day meant something very different from Eddie's signature. The contracts were not equal. And for the next 30 years, Michael Anthony would pay for that difference in ways that went far beyond money. You grew up listening to these four men as brothers. Did you ever sense something was wrong beneath the surface? Comment yes if you felt it too. The first Van Halen album dropped on February 10th, 1978. It did not ease its way into the world. It detonated. Within weeks, rock radio stations across America were playing Eruption, Eddie's 1 minute and 42-second guitar solo, as if it were a complete song, because it was. Critics who had spent years covering rock and roll admitted openly that they had never heard anything like it. Guitarists who had been playing for decades put down their instruments and reconsidered everything they thought they knew. The album sold over 1 million copies in its first year. It would eventually sell over 10 million. Michael Anthony was on every track. His voice, warm, powerful, and perfectly placed, formed the upper harmony on almost every song. When fans sang along to Runnin' with the Devil or You Really Got Me, they were singing Michael's notes. His harmonies were the emotional ceiling of the Van Halen sound. Without them, the music fell hollow. But the royalty statements told a different story. From the very beginning, the songwriting credits on Van Halen albums belonged almost exclusively to Eddie Alex and David Lee Roth. Michael Anthony received a flat performance fee, a salary. While the other three collected publishing royalties that compounded year after year, Michael took home what he was given and asked no questions. He was not naive. He understood the structure. But understanding something and accepting it are two very different things. Through the 1980s, as Van Halen became one of the highest-grossing live acts in the world, pulling in crowds of 70,000, 80,000, sometimes over 100,000 people, Michael stood at the side of that stage every night and delivered. He never missed a show. He never phoned it in. His famous Jack Daniels bass, a custom instrument shaped like a bottle of whiskey, became one of the most recognizable images in rock history. The fans loved him. The crowd roared when he stepped to the mic. But inside the band's financial structure, he remained something closer to an employee than a partner. And when David Lee Roth left in 1985 and Sammy Hagar walked in, the internal dynamics of Van Halen were about to shift in ways that would slowly, quietly push Michael Anthony toward a door he never saw coming. By 2004, something inside Van Halen had quietly broken. The band had survived David Lee Roth leaving. They had survived Sammy Hagar leaving. They had survived addiction, lawsuits, and the kind of internal pressure that destroys most bands within 5 years. But what they could not survive, what no amount of talent or history could paper over, was a slow erosion of trust between Eddie Van Halen and the man who had stood beside him for 30 years. Eddie's struggles with alcohol had become severe. His health was deteriorating. In 2000, he had been diagnosed with tongue cancer, a diagnosis he publicly linked to holding a metal guitar pick in his mouth for decades. He survived, but the man who came out the other side was changed. Darker, more isolated, more suspicious of the people around him. Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's son, had begun playing bass. He was 17 years old. In 2006, Van Halen announced a reunion tour with David Lee Roth. It was the news fans had waited 20 years to hear. The original lineup, the real thing. Tickets sold out in hours. The anticipation was enormous. Michael Anthony's phone did not ring. No meeting. No conversation. No explanation delivered face to face. The man who had played on every Van Halen album, who had harmonized on every anthem, who had given 30 years of his life to that band, learned through the music industry rumor mill that he had been replaced by a teenager. Wolfgang Van Halen is a talented musician. That is not in question. But the decision to remove Michael Anthony was not about talent. People close to the band said it plainly. Eddie wanted control, full control, of the music, of the money, of the legacy. And Michael Anthony, quiet, loyal, patient Michael Anthony, had become a reminder of everything Eddie could not fully own. In a 2012 interview, Michael said simply, "It hurt. Of course it hurt." For words, 30 years of friendship, one sentence. But what happened next? The phone call that never came, and the reconciliation that died before it could breathe, is the part of this story that will stay with you longest. After the firing, Michael Anthony did not disappear. He joined Sammy Hagar in a new project called Chickenfoot in 2008. Guitarist Joe Satriani, drummer Chad Smith of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. The band was loud, alive, and unapologetically joyful. They toured, they recorded, they reminded anyone paying attention that Michael Anthony's bass and voice were not footnotes in rock history. They were pillars. But the wound from Van Halen did not close. In interviews through those years, Michael chose his words carefully. He spoke about Eddie with a complicated tenderness that only comes from loving someone who has hurt you deeply. He did not rage. He did not weaponize his pain for publicity. He talked about the early days, the backyard parties, the Starwood, the moment they all believed something enormous was happening, with a warmth that never fully hardened into bitterness. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020. Lung cancer. He was 65 years old. Michael Anthony found out the way millions of fans did, through a public announcement. There was no final phone call between them, no private goodbye, no moment where 30 years of shared history was acknowledged between just the two of them, in a quiet room, without cameras or legacy or money in the way. Michael posted a tribute online that same day. He called Eddie the greatest rock guitarist who ever lived. He talked about their friendship in the early years. He talked about what it felt like to stand next to him on a stage. He did not mention the firing. He did not mention the royalties. He did not mention the silence. Because some griefs are too layered for a public statement. Some losses arrive wrapped inside other losses. Michael Anthony was not just mourning a bandmate. He was mourning every conversation that never happened. Every year the phone stayed quiet. Every version of a reconciliation that existed only in the space between what two people meant to say and what they never did. At 70 years old, Michael Anthony carries all of it, and what he is now saying publicly about Eddie, about the band, about what he deserves to be remembered for, is the chapter of the story that history almost forgot to write. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not stand at the front of the stage. It does not shred a guitar solo that stops the world. It does not wear a sequin jumpsuit or breathe fire or demand the spotlight. Follow it everywhere. It simply shows up every night for 30 years, and it holds a foundation together while everything above it burns bright and loud and beautiful. That is what Michael Anthony did. At 70, he is still playing, still touring with Sammy Hagar and The Circle, still hitting harmonies that make audiences close their eyes and feel something they cannot name. When he walks on stage today, there is no bitterness in his face. There is something quieter and more durable than bitterness. There is ownership, a man finally standing fully inside his own story. In recent interviews, Michael has begun speaking with a directness he spent decades softening. He has confirmed what fans long suspected, that his royalty situation with Van Halen was deeply unfair, that his contributions to the band's vocal sound were never properly credited or compensated, that being replaced by Wolfgang felt like erasure, not just professional erasure, personal erasure. But he has also said something more important than any of that. He has said he would do it again, because the music was real. The early years were real. The feeling of standing next to Eddie Van Halen on a stage in 1979 and playing to a crowd that had never heard anything like them, that was real. And no contract dispute, no firing, no years of silence can reach back through time and unmake something that actually happened. The Van Halen catalog has sold over 56 million albums worldwide. Michael Anthony's voice is on every one of them. That is not a footnote. That is a foundation. And foundations, by their nature, outlast everything built on top of them. Michael Anthony did not just survive Van Halen. He outlived the silence. And his story, the real one, the full one, is only now being heard the way it always deserved to be.